Hello, I'm Chris Anderson. Welcome to the TED Interview, the podcast series where I sit down with a TED speaker and we start where their TED Talk ended and explore their ideas in much greater depth. So, on today's episode, we explore questions of vulnerability, artistry, and how to make a living from being creative in the extraordinary company of singer, songwriter, artist, performer Amanda Palmer, the creative force behind the Dresden Dolls.
Coin-operated boy sitting on the shelf. He is just a toy, but I turn him on and he comes to life.
Amanda hasn't been on a mainstream record label since 2010. Instead, she's figured out a whole new way to fund her art. Anchored in pioneering efforts on Kickstarter and Patreon, hence her massively popular 2014 TED Talk, The Art of Asking.
And through the very act of asking people, I'd connected with them. And when you connect with them, people want to help you. It's kind of counterintuitive for a lot of artists. They don't want to ask for things. It's not easy. It's not easy to ask. And a lot of artists have a problem with this. Asking makes you vulnerable.
In this episode, I'm going to do a lot of asking, but in a different kind of way. Amanda has a really deep and personal connection with her fans, and I'm curious to discover to what extent this is the key to anyone who wants to make a living from creativity in the brave new future ahead of us. And as a special bonus, she gives us an off-the-cuff rendition of one of her greatest hits. Amanda Palmer, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to be here.
So I'm pretty excited for this conversation because you're someone completely different from almost everyone I grew up with. You know, I I grew up the child of missionaries in quite a sort of safe world. I was a good, quote, unquote, boy. At first glance, looking at you, you're everything that my parents would have been horrified by, I would have been scared by, frankly. And so it's kind of, I'm a little trembly having you here face to face.
What can I do to disarm you right off the bat? I don't have any tattoos.
Oh, well, what a surprise. Am I right to think of it this way? Basically as an artist who makes herself almost uniquely vulnerable to the public, to her fans, to call them what you will.
I think a lot of artists are like that. You know, like you can look at all sorts of trajectories of a creative person's life and what they work on, right? What they master. And it's not like I set off on this particular path, but one of the things that I found I've been trying to master in the last 20 years of songwriting and touring and performing is like the art of honesty and how bare I can be. You know, not just on the internet or on a blog, but, you know, on a stage. You know, it's not something that happened overnight. It's something that I've hit on as I stumbled into it at shows and with my blog more and more. I always found that saying the difficult thing, the embarrassing thing, the vulnerable thing, was always what connected me more. It's always what took me up the next step artistically and in terms of my connection with my fan base. So I paid attention to that. And when writing and when performing and when putting things together, I just always held that as the key question. Like, what am I afraid to say? What's too much? What's too embarrassing? Because that's probably what I should be saying, because that's what's going to resonate with people.
And that's been true right from the earliest days. Like you built this connection with your blog audience early on by opening the door on everything.
So my band in my 20s that sort of shot me up into knownness was the Dresden Dolls, and it was just me and a drummer. If you look at those early songs, they're a really interesting combination of the kind of vulnerability that I'm talking about. These really bare and spare and sometimes aggressive songs about doubt and insecurity and grappling with what it meant to be female. And I was very scared in my teens and 20s, and I used music very therapeutically to work through a lot of that stuff. But also, I was doing what every musician tries to do. I was just trying to be cool. I just wanted my music to be awesome. I wanted it to be fun and funny and relatable and something that my peers would want to listen to. And, that's how I grew up as a teenager. I mean, I sort of grew up worshiping in the Church of Rock and Roll.
Hmm.
And even though I was also raised an Episcopalian,
Were you?
I was. I mean, it's something that a lot of people don't know about me. I was a church-going, choir-singing, church 2 times a week with my mom kid until I was confirmed, and my mom gave me the choice to go or not go, and I always chose to sleep in on Sundays because I was a teenager. But a lot of my musical education, you could actually hear it more on my new record than anywhere else.
Hmm.
It's like a lot of these songs have all these hints of like the liturgical in them. And that's what was a lot of my early musical education was Bach and Handel and all of that kind of stuff.
So by being open, by, as you say, being bare and like literally physically naked and
Not all the time.
not all the time, but emotionally so, as very much as well. I mean, that certainly attracted a lot of people. Was there to some extent like a sort of almost a calculated, yes, I'm going to shock people, I'm going to like, this is the strategy to win attention? Or was it at heart, honestly, like, this is the only person I know how to be. By being this, I will attract the people who want to come on this journey with me?
That's such an interesting question that I have tangled with all my life. And one of the most difficult things I struggled with as a kid and as a teenager was trying to untangle the paradox of wanting to be seen, wanting and needing love and attention, and especially as I realized that I had an artistic talent, wanting and needed to be seen as an artist, as a performer, but also not being able to square that with the message that I was given from my parents and from a lot of my teachers that being an attention getter was bad.
Hmm.
And I really struggled with that. And, still to this day, I'm 42 and I'm very grounded at this point. But it's still an Achilles heel. All I need to do is see a journalist saying, it doesn't matter what Amanda Palmer's doing, she's just trying to get attention. But at this point, I'm like, wait. Like, that's what artists do.
Hmm.
They try to get your attention. That's our job, is to get your attention. And, and if you're a good artist, you use yourself as a vessel to get someone's attention about something larger than just your own ego. And I didn't really understand the complexity and the nuance of that when I was a teenager and in my 20s. I was too busy just being insecure and constantly, neurotically questioning my own motivations. To the point where I wrote songs about it, Chris. Like, listen to the Dresden Dolls' first album. It tries to answer your question. Like, why am I doing this? Am I performing for you? Is it real? What's real? What's authentic? Am I? Are you? Oh my God, like life is an acid trip.
So in a way, the answer to that question, of course I was trying to get attention. That is what I should have done. It's actually what I like. If you think about the modern world that we're in, everyone is trying to win a little part of the attention war. Otherwise, you're irrelevant.
Sure.
I mean, so much of what plays out online. I mean, Ted, we're fighting every day to try and win attention.
You're fighting the rest of the internet, Chris. Every day you wake up and you fight the whole internet.
We're going against really addictive internet memes. So we're all in that game. So when people say to me, why are you dumbing down this idea? I say, well, do you want this idea to be forever invisible, or do you want some people to see it sometime? How about we put a powerful headline on it?
Yeah.
You have been your own powerful headline your whole life. Let's go back to this idea of the artist kind of opening themselves up. I mean, I'm sure you would argue that even an artist who wasn't like you here in the 21st century, posting lots of stuff online, but someone might be an oil painter or a sculptor, the work they're doing is not immediately, obviously, physically about them. It's about something else. But if they don't vulnerably put their soul into that piece of art, they are failing as an artist. They're a technician, not an artist. Is that how to think of it?
Sounds good to me. I mean, being vulnerable doesn't just mean writing a blog post or a song about, your naked feelings. It's apparent in every single art form. It shows up everywhere. It's just all about the intention. I mean, this is something that I've thought about so deeply since marrying Neil, because Neil lives and breathes fiction.
Mm.
He does fiction. That's his art form. But it's infused with his vulnerability. And the more vulnerable he makes himself, the better the work is. It shows up as fiction the way that oil painting shows up as an oil painting, but you can feel it. You can tell.
Mm. But where does the borderline come? So vulnerability is powerful. Sort of sharing of yourself is powerful. Is there a borderline between where vulnerability crosses into a kind of a narcissism, where because the people who love you say Amanda Palmer's incredible. She gives so much of herself. And the people who hate you, I think, some of them say, Amanda Palmer, she is so full of herself. And maybe those two things can be true actually literally at the same time. Or are there any rules for nudging people towards the one rather than the other?
I think you'd be very hard pressed to find an artist who was very, very open and vulnerable and did not also get that kind of criticism. I think they just are part and parcel. And where you've got an artist being very honest and vulnerable, you're going to have the flip side criticism that they're full of themselves. Because anytime you're using yourself as the canvas, anytime you're using your own experiences, whether you're a writer, a memoirist, a songwriter, a stand-up comedian, when you're using yourself as the source material, you are literally full of yourself. That's what you're filling yourself with. That's what your art form is made out of. Your material, instead of oil paint, is the stories of your life. And of course, anyone could frame that as narcissistic. You're just the easiest target, which is why it can be easier to write fiction. It can be easier to paint pictures because you're not directly harvesting the truth of your own experiences. And we all know it when we feel it. When we look at someone and they're harvesting their own life for their art and we have that sense that they're full of shit. I think the dial that's at play there is how much the artist is using their experience to call attention simply to themselves or to call attention to something much larger. Because we're all the same, right? So anything that's really personal is going to wind up being universal in the right artist's hands.
Yeah, so this is the key thing that I would love to understand. People who see you, exposing your thoughts, your feelings, your creativity in an intimate way, love you because they get something from it. Is it possible to be at the same time sort of opening yourself up, but also saying, okay, am I giving people a gift or is this indulgent?
I think you get better at it as an artist. At least I can speak for myself. When I was starting out as an artist, at age 15, age 20, age 25, you don't have any handle on this part of the job. You're just scared shitless and you're getting up in front of a stage in front of a bunch of people and putting it out there, just not even understanding these levers and dials. You just have written your music, you've started your band, you're out there, and I'm sure every artist in every genre walks through that gauntlet. And then you start to understand who you are and what you actually really have to contribute, what your particular talent is, and you start following that. What you have to say and how you have to say it that really will resonate with some people. And a really important part of the development in any creative person is really having to come to terms with the fact that you're never going to be for everybody. If what you want is universal acclaim, you've got a really rough job cut out for you. The things that are required of you to have universal acclaim are impossible Herculean tasks. And this is actually something that I really learned in my 30s. if you look at your job as an artist as a service job, like not an ego job, a service job. I belong to this tribe. This person makes shoes. This person builds bridges. This person does the neuroscience. My job is to be the artist. What do they need from me? What stories am I supposed to be telling? The more I really thought about my job that way and looked at what was resonating with my crowd, the easier my path became. And also the more direct my songwriting became. Because I just felt like I didn't have time to waste not being direct.
Well, we're going to talk in a bit, I think, about what the future looks like for creatives of all kinds, because it's a big riddle and it's such an important question, I think, for the future. But I want to just understand a bit more about your personality. I mean, you're someone who, after performing or whatever, you would get naked, you would let 250 strangers draw on you with magic markers, and yet there were lines that couldn't be crossed. I'm trying to understand you, Amanda. Like, are you the world's biggest extrovert? Like, you get so much energy from this connection with people. It feels like you crave people, you need people in a way that others maybe couldn't as much. But there's still a point where you know, despite that, because of that, you feel intense loneliness sometimes. I want to understand you. What's going on inside that head that makes all these things happen?
Oh, God, there's so many things I could say there, Chris. You know what might help is if I talk about something that I don't talk about very often, which is I come from a theater background. I became really passionate in college about experimental theater and performance art. And I had my brain blown wide open in college by artists who I had never heard of. Like these bizarre, courageous acts of certain performance artists to test the limits of what was socially acceptable, what were the boundaries of intimacy. That's sort of what I was getting at. That stunt, you know, or piece of performance art or whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter, that I did with my fans, where I said, here, everyone take a magic marker. I'm going to stand here naked. If you want to draw on me, go for it. I think one of the more fascinating things to think about isn't so much what I was thinking and feeling, which I'd love to describe to you. I mean, it's like the ultimate trust fall, right? And you've got to remember, these weren't strangers. These were the people who had paid $100 to support the making of an album. These people had faith in me. They were the initiated.
They were part of your tribe.
They were the deep, you know,
Right.
they were the first concentric circle of my tribe.
But tell me, how did it feel? Because I imagine not many people listening to this will ever quite be in that situation. So tell me.
It felt exhilarating to enter into a space where I was making myself that dangerously vulnerable. And I'm trying to think if there's a good analogy, but it's probably akin to what a more average person feels when they get up at a podium in front of a congregation of any kind and share their feelings about loss or share their feelings, their real, deep, true feelings about anything. It's very frightening, but it's also exhilarating to look at a group of 100 people and say, I trust you this much that I'm going to share this with you. Will you hold me? Will you listen to me? Are we doing this?
And you did it without ever explicitly saying, here are rules, you know, like you can draw here but not here.
The rules are pretty obvious, right? But also this is why it was fascinating. I was like, what's going to happen? Here I am. Take your markers. And I wish you could have been there to see like the first brave person to just come up to me with their red marker and start drawing a flower on my belly. And then everyone just piled on. And it was like this, it was just this really incredible experience. But, you know, what was going on in their heads was probably more interesting.
What did people tell you?
That they felt really honored that I allowed them to be so close to me. Literally physically close, that it felt like a real act of trust and communion. Because that's really what I was saying. I was saying, this is it. I totally trust you. This is how much I trust you. I'm going to let you paint on my naked body. There was like a levity to it. There was a silliness. I usually was holding a glass of wine with a beaming smile on my face. I wasn't doing a like really stern, strict Marina Abramovich gig where it was like, this is art. I was like, this isn't really art. This is fun. If this isn't fun, let's not do this. I'm just about to go back into the arena. I gave my TED Talk when I was right in the nadir of one of the worst moments of my life. And giving that TED Talk was kind of a real salvation for me to sort of settle the score with the universe. And I haven't really been back into the arena since then. I've been quietly, you know, more domestic, having a kid, writing a book. I haven't really been out and about and tangling with public opinion since then. And I'm about to do it all again. And I have to say, I'm not afraid. Nothing really scares me anymore, but I'm like, I can feel myself bracing for impact. The same way I'm sure you do when you put something out there and you just don't know who's going to yell at you.
Well, we're going to come to some of the issues you raised in the TED Talk there, which was, by the way, an extraordinary talk. 10 million viewers closing in now, I think, on this idea of the art of asking, which has been a theme throughout your life. So we're going to come back to that in a bit. But soon after that talk, you did actually land, I think, in one of the more painful controversies of your life after the Boston bombing. You talked about this in your new show, very powerfully, I thought. So you've got this new show. There will be no intermission. There is one intermission, at least in the version I saw,
Yeah.
which was funny.
I recorded a record that basically is it's a very memoir record of the last 7 years, and this is the touring stage show that goes along with it.
It's remarkable. But during that, you spoke about that controversy that happened, I think, a bit after that TED Talk. And this almost goes to this same criticism that's been made of you. So you were stunned by the Boston bombing. You were there on Twitter grieving with your friends and followers about, the injuries and all the rest of it. And at some point, there was a survivor who was caught after dying in his boat. Yeah, that's right. And you wrote a poem imagining him. And you described it in the show. Like, talk about that, because this brought you a deluge of criticism for sort of sympathizing with terrorists and accusations that you were doing this for attention.
Yeah.
But the people who had been with you on the whole journey of your experience during that time saw a different part of you. Talk about that.
Well, I've never told this whole story. This is actually a great place to tell it. So Neil and I were living in Boston at the time. My best friend had cancer, and we were sort of taking care of him, and I was taking him to chemo a lot. And so we were living in this rental house. The bomb went off just a few blocks from the apartment that I'd been living in for 15 years. And I discovered something about Twitter that I hadn't known before, which is that there was a limit on the number of tweets you're allowed to send in any given hour, and I didn't know because I had never tweeted 100 times in an hour. But while it was happening, and then while the manhunt and the drama and everything was going on, I just went to Twitter, and it became a kind of a communal gathering point for everyone in Boston because everyone was stuck in their houses. People were told not to assemble. And what's so incredible about that moment is that that's what everybody wanted to do. Everybody just wanted to be together and not be scared. Everyone wanted to go to a park or gather in their churches or find each other. Because what a frightening thing to happen right in your city. And instead, I just started retweeting everybody's tweets, what they were feeling, that they were at home crying, they were holding their children, they were petting their cats, they were looking out the window, they were seeing the police cars. They needed to go get groceries, but they were being told not to leave their houses. And I just thought, wow, I'm one of the few people in Boston with over 1 million Twitter followers. I'm going to amplify this. I'm going to just share our story and our grief with the world and with my commentary and my hugging and my holding. It was incredibly comforting. And right after Jarhart Tsarnaev was found, so I don't know if you remember the details of the story, but there was this long, dramatic manhunt. He ran around the suburbs of Boston. Everyone was locked down in their houses. He snuck into somebody's backyard, and they had a boat with a cover on it, and he hid in the bottom of this boat, bleeding, having just committed like one of the most atrocious acts that you could think of. And I was sitting in a cafe the day after it happened, and I was just trying to imagine what his state of mind would have been. This kid, right? He was a kid. He was 17. And I was sort of comparing and contrasting it with my own state of mind, sitting there very blithely, Porter Square Books in Cambridge with nice coffee and a nice snack. And I was just like, what did that feel like? Knowing that you're just waiting there to be captured, knowing what blood is on your hands, knowing what you just did. I just couldn't make that leap of empathy, but I kind of tried. And that's what the poem was attempting to be. And it's almost even indefensible as a poem, because I love poetry. It was more just like a stream of consciousness blog ramble, which I'm famous for. I like unedited stream of consciousness. Here's my morning cup of coffee, and I'm out. And I even showed it to Neil, who was with me in the bookstore, and I said, do you think I'm going to get shit for this? And Neil was like, no, it's lovely. Post it. And then
I don't think he had his PR hat on at the time.
Oh my God. The tweets were coming in so fast I couldn't read them. And I became sort of this weird new public enemy number one. And I was a terrorist sympathizer and, a terrorist lover and a terrible poet on top of it. The terrible poet didn't bother me. I have a thick skin. And honestly, the right-wing people hating on me didn't hurt me very much either because it was dismissible. But then the Boston press got a hold of it and started running articles about how tasteless it was. Not that I had written a poem about the Boston bombing, but because, I wrote a follow-up blog insisting that we had to have compassion and empathy for this kid. And I talked about this in the show the other night, but it was almost like my worldview cracked open. It was almost as seismic as my jaw dropping when Donald Trump was elected president. I just couldn't believe that so many people disagreed with me. And that was a real turning point in my life because I thought that all of my lefty liberal friends felt the way I did about compassion and empathy being necessary at all costs for all people.
It's such an interesting question because I certainly believe deeply in empathy as one of the sort of key human skills that we need to practice if we're to have any hope at all. People really struggle, though, to juggle intense emotions to hold them at one time. And I'm guessing if you publish that same poem/post a year later, it would have had a very different response. But in the moment when someone's relative was injured or whatever, it's
Right.
like there's just rage. Lord knows. I think the way the human mind works is certain things just don't compete or connect. I'm
Yeah.
guessing if you had your time again, you might prefer to hold it, or does the proud Amanda Palmer say, no, that's who I am, and I did the right thing, and fuck 'em.
I don't think I would ever say I did the right thing. I don't think there is a right thing. What's so interesting about the internet is that none of the blowback came from my community. And the poem and the stream of consciousness was for my blog readership, who all, if you look at the comments that came in the first 5 hours, they all got it because they had sort of gone on the journey with me and they understood where I was coming from.
This happens again and again, doesn't it, online, where context gets shifted, disaster erupts. When you see a picture out of context, someone posts it with a different framing, and suddenly everything
It explodes.
erupts.
Yeah, and this is a problem all over the place, right? There's very little room for deep context and nuance. And also my fans, my readers, my circle, they've watched me talk about these themes for years. One of the things that I wish I had had language for at the time was just that it was to remind everybody that empathy is not endorsement.
Yes.
Just because you can feel compassion for someone doesn't mean that you can't indict them for a crime, doesn't mean that you can't legally deal with them, understand that what they did was a horrific act. Those things are totally separable
Yeah.
and must be separable, right?
We're terribly bad at forming nuanced views of each other. Like, it feels like there's this huge human tendency to want to group people into good guys and bad guys instead of believing the Solzhenitsyn line that good and evil runs through every human heart, and that we should actually empathize with our enemies to have any chance of actually building any bridge.
We must. I mean, that's the whole point of restorative justice, right?
Yeah.
Is that without that bridge, society doesn't work. It collapses.
I think it was 2012. You did this Kickstarter campaign, and somehow became like the first artist ever to raise $1 million for a new album. I mean, it's definitely got my attention. It was actually one of the key reasons why we invited you to come and speak at TED. It's like, who the hell is this woman? How does she do this? How did you do this? So you'd built this incredible tribe, but you were also quite clever in what you put out there as sort of some of the rewards for supporting you. It wasn't just that you would get the new CD. It was that you could have maybe a party where Amanda Palmer herself would show up and crowd surf.
Yeah.
So I mean, talk about that, because that was kind of brilliant, and I'm not sure that everyone, maybe anyone else, could have done it quite the way you offered that.
So business-wise, this gets really fascinating. I remember sitting with Neil on a plane and doing some back-of-the-napkin math before I decided to use Kickstarter. And I thought, wow, okay, if I bake everything into this Kickstarter, and when I think about all of the money that people might spend on me, at me over the course of a year, and I do something that I've always wanted to do, which is house parties. And, they're sort of hard to do and hard to arrange. But if I have some money underneath them and there's a point, I can do this, and I can go to different cities and do house parties. And I just, I did the back of the napkin math. And I remember turning to Neil and saying, I bet if I do this right and I pre-sell everything and I preload everything, this Kickstarter will probably make about $1 million. And here's the fatal flaw. And I looked at him and I was like, and then everyone will find out about the record. And they'll all talk about my music. And of course, nothing could have been further from the truth. The tragedy of all of that is that the Kickstarter story grossly eclipsed the art. And people were, for better or worse, people were so fascinated by the dollar signs that the album that I had spent 6 years working on became almost a footnote at best. And that was heartbreaking. As the artist who had worked enslaved for 6 years to make this record, the fact that the album was trivial to most people and most journalists was really painful.
And then there was this follow-on controversy where people got mad at you because you invited musicians to come to some of your events as volunteers, and people were going, "Wait a sec, $1 million? What are you doing?" What don't people understand about what happened there?
Well, so what's important is that I didn't invite musicians. I invited my fans, who were musicians, who were probably coming to the show anyway, or who would be excited about the opportunity. And there was a real lineage of this practice in my band and also in the punk community and in the folk community, which is you just put the invitation out there and you say, we're not going to tour with a giant string section. We're a band and a bus. But if anyone plays violin, plays oboe, plays trumpet, plays anything, show up early. We're going to give you some charts. We'll give you free tickets to the show. If you want to play with us, come play with us. And so it should tell you something that I didn't even think twice about doing that. I just, there was no little voice in the back of my head saying, someone's going to come and yell at you about this. It was so baked into how I had been doing business. And my fan base was psyched. We got volunteers all over the country.
Mm.
And then a woman who was a classical musician got wind of this and wrote an open letter to me saying, this feels exploitative. And I remember reading that and going like, oh, this is no big deal. She doesn't understand. I'll just write her back and say, no, you don't understand. This is a consensual, joyful relationship between me and my fans. We've been doing it for years and years. But somehow it escalated. And I also understand the musicians who were upset, who were outside of my community and milieu. I could understand how it looked to them from the outside looking in, not knowing who I was, not really understanding the community and how we worked and what the language of exchange was. This was 2012. Like, people were out of work. They're still out of work. I don't know how many musicians in New York are graduating Juilliard right now, not knowing if their gazillion-dollar classical music education is going to earn them a penny. But you could understand how it would feel if you were coming from a place of scarcity and you were a really good classical musician who couldn't get a gig, and you looked over and you saw me doing that. I get it. And the fact that I had done the $1 million Kickstarter was the landscape against which all of the criticism, was flung, which was also ironic because it seemed that people didn't quite understand that my $1 million wasn't pocketed.
Right.
I was running a pre-order record label business, and that $1 million vanished pretty much the minute it showed up back into manufacturing and delivering all of that stuff.
Trips all over the world for these
Oh my
parties, etc.
Well, and 25,000 records had to go to people in New Zealand and China and Australia and Germany. Like, I'm not proud of it, but that Kickstarter actually lost money.
Did it?
It did. It did. Do you want to know? I mean, as a business person, you can appreciate this. Do you know what we forgot? Do you know what we forgot to budget for?
What did you forget?
Shipping. I offered free international shipping because I thought that it would pay for itself. It didn't. It cost $300,000 to ship all of those records and turntables and books all over the world. We ate it.
Wow.
We ate it on that Kickstarter.
Have you said that before?
Oh, probably not on a platform this large. And you know what? I stand by it. I stand by all of it.
Amanda, you brought your ukulele with you. I think we might need a ukulele break here. Give us a couple lines of something, anything. I would love that.
Okay, so this is going to be a fun game, Chris. I'm going to start playing, and then you're going to have to gong me.
I will gong you.
When you think the point has been made, go.
Okay.
In my mind, in a future 5 years from now, I'm 120 pounds, and I never get hungover because I will be the picture of discipline, never minding what state I'm in, and I will be someone I admire. And it's funny how I imagined that I would be that person now, but it does not seem to have happened. Maybe I've just forgotten how to see that I'm not exactly the person that I want to be. You haven't gonged me yet.
I haven't gonged you. We need the last verse.
I'm waiting for you to gong. And in my mind, when I'm old, I am beautiful, planting tulips and vegetables, which I will mindfully watch over, not like me now. I'm so busy with everything that I don't look at anything. But I'm sure I'll look when I am older. And it's funny how I imagined that I would be that person now. But that's not what I want. If that's what I wanted, then I'd be giving up somehow. How strange to see that I don't want to be the person that I want to be. And in my mind, I imagine so many things that aren't really happening. And when they put me in the ground, I'll start pounding the lid, saying I haven't finished yet. I still have a tattoo to get that says I'm living in the moment. And it's funny how I imagined that I would win this winless fight. But maybe it really isn't funny that I've been fighting all my life. But maybe I have to think it's funny if I want to live before I die. And maybe it's funniest of all to think I'll die before I actually see that I am exactly the person that I thought I'd be. Fuck yes, I am exactly the person that I want to be.
Standing O here. Wow. Good. I mean, that was incredible.
That's actually an older song. It's sort of in the lineage of the songs on the new record, which is really more of like a very memoir-y folk record.
But it's a beautiful transition to this new stage of your life where you're talking about, you're preparing to reemerge, back into the arena. Just based on that, you've been dreaming of a future you. Is this future you the future you that earlier songwriter imagined?
God, that's such a great question, Chris. I think so. I got very interested because of my mentor, Anthony, who I talk a lot about in the show and I write a lot about in the book. I started meditating and doing yoga and getting really serious about mindfulness practice in my early 20s and going to silent retreats. I really clocked in my 20s that if I practiced and if I really committed myself to a path of mindfulness, that something would eventually emerge out of that. And, that song, if nothing else, it's a song about Zen. It's about how funny it is that we live trapped in this projection and anxiety about the future and the past. And we miss a lot when we do that. And the older I've gotten and the more I've physically practiced meditation and yoga and read a lot and considered a lot, the more on board I am with constantly ripping up the script of whatever my expectations were of myself 5 years ago, 10 years ago. A lot of the suffering that I see is based on just that. People still working desperately off the scripts that they wrote for themselves when they were 25 or 35 or yesterday. I didn't know that I was going to marry Neil Gaiman. I didn't know that I was going to do a TED Talk. I didn't know that I was going to have a kid. I didn't know that I was going to do a tour where I get up in front of thousands of people and talk about abortion and miscarriage. None of this was in the plan, Chris, but it's happening.
I mean, you're a mother now. You've got this beautiful son, Ash, and someone else in your shoes might now be writing songs about the joy you get from Ash and whatever. And the song you actually sang the other night was about, thank God the baby didn't die.
Yeah.
Like, this is intimate, difficult stuff, but you turned it into a song that is poignant and delightful. What led to that song?
Every parent can relate to looking at your child and feeling love and joy untold. But every parent can also relate to the deepest, most primal fear of losing your child.
Indeed.
it's the flip side of that love. And there are a lot of songs about how much people love their children. I didn't know of any songs where people addressed the terror that you feel in your heart when you see your baby falling off a bed. I wanted to write that song. And it was a scary song to write, and that's why I knew it was the right song. I mean, that's been my guiding star lately. When I hesitate, when I'm sitting at the piano and I hesitate, that's when I know I'm going down the
On the
right
right track.
path.
Yeah. If your ideas don't scare you, they're not big enough.
Yeah. I think a lot of this comes back to the very top of the podcast where you opened with like how different we were growing up, right? And I don't know what your script was for yourself as a teenager and where you thought you would go and who you thought you were supposed to be. But I was a self-styled rebel. I was a teenage rebel. That was how I identified. And well into my 20s, like, that's sort of how I thought of myself. I was the weird one, I was the youngest of a lot of children. I was the outcast. I was the performer, the joker. And it feels like a lot of the work of my life of the last 10 or 15 years has been stripping all of that back, taking what's useful to do my service job as an artist, but also really having to shed a lot of that. Because a big part of being a teenage rebel and remaining a teenage rebel in your 20s, which I did, growing up was very scary. As a teenager, I didn't want to grow up. Growing up was uncool. Parenthood looked uncool. Being mature and balanced and going to bed early looked uncool. So I've had to redefine, and luckily I've been able to do it, I think, in part and thanks to my practice of mindfulness of like, what do I need right now? What feels wonderful right now? What do I have to give and say and contribute right now? Not according to Amanda at 15 or 25, but right now at 42 with this kid in this hall. And I think a lot of artists struggle with this because artists and creatives, we do a lot of self-definition in our 20s, teens and 20s. We define ourselves as artists, and then it can be really hard to evolve.
I want to explore some of the themes in your talk. You gave this talk on, the art of asking. And it feels to me like it's potentially relevant to the future in a deeper way than that goes, beyond the way that it was even initially interpreted. So you gave this talk, you linked your earlier life as a street artist, standing on a box as a bride and giving people flowers in exchange for $1 with your Kickstarter campaign, and just made the case so eloquently that, look, in the 21st century, in the future that we're heading towards, it's okay, it's right for artists to ask. Don't be embarrassed about it. Just say a bit more about that, about why that felt like an important thing to say and the reaction to it.
I think we're incredibly unimaginative nowadays when it comes to how things are exchanged. We live in this super small-minded, capitalistic box where everything has a specific value meted out by specific people. And if you rewind the clock just a little bit, this has not been the case with human beings. Human beings over the course of our long history have come up with incredibly creative ways of exchanging stuff and energy and support and help and knowledge. And the way we do it right now may be working, may not be working, but I don't think we're tapping remotely into the possibilities that are out there. We could go off on a 2-hour tangent about why capitalism isn't totally working. But even just looking at the TED structure, I mean, you must spend thousands of hours thinking about this. What has value? What do we charge for? What should just be free? Who gets access? Why? When it's not just a simple monetary exchange, where's the value? Who decides? Da 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 da. And these things are fascinating to me. I write about this in the book, in The Art of Asking, but in my early 20s, I was getting this bizarre education in all of these things from the most unlikely places. The punk rock scene, where nobody got paid and everybody helped out. Street performance, where you stood up and nobody paid you unless they just felt like it. Working in an ice cream store where we worked for tips. Working as a stripper, where, you were paid a slave wage, but then you were being paid for this bizarre act by these strange people. And on and on and on.
I mean, we haven't talked about it, but in your book, you mentioned that for a while you worked as a stripper. And like, do you look back on that with fondness, with horror, with like how?
Somewhere in between fondness and horror. Certainly no horror. I mean, it was a weird job, right? But I was a shameless feminist. So I went into the stripper job going, I'm not afraid to do this. I'm comfortable being naked. And I'm just going to treat this like an anthropological, sociological experiment. Why not? Let's see what happens.
And maybe stronger than some other people who might go that route and end up getting exploited and.
Yeah, I never felt exploited. I definitely felt gross. I mean, there were moments where I would be, literally naked on stage in front of a bunch of drunk men thinking, Amanda, do you really think this is wise? And do you really think this is some kind of anthropological feminist information gathering mission? Or are you really just completely bananas? But It paid for my band's first record, so whatever, I'll stand by it.
Part of the journey. What's so interesting trying to put some of these pieces together? Because I do think there is a 2-hour discussion around what is the future of capitalism, what's the future of the economy. A lot of people believe that huge numbers of the current things that we all do as jobs are going to get washed away by automation, and that one of humanity's last stands is creativity. Computers can be creative, but we probably will have an edge on them for a long time to come. And how would that economy work? Can we actually picture a world that is, I don't know, there's some sort of economic values being created, somehow there's money flowing into the economy somehow, either through the very rich, through tax distribution, through universal basic income, through some kind of, there's some kind of source there. But a lot of people are making their money as creatives in a very different kind of economy, where the whole thing about creativity is you may not know the value of the experience to you until you've experienced it. And so to pay up front for it, once it's deeply inefficient, if you could solve the freeloader problem, then it's better for people to pay, having had the experience, and say, do it that way. There's something very beautiful about that. Can you picture this idea of a very different type of exchange just continuing to grow, where it's an expectation and a delight to give money in recognition of the greatness of a creative experience that someone has given you?
Wow, what a question. I'll try to answer you by telling you what I have learned in the last few years. And some of what I've learned has been really shocking to me since starting Patreon. If you're listening and you don't really know what that is, Patreon is basically a subscription service to an artist. It's a permanent commitment.
Right.
To an artist. You give your credit card to an artist and they charge you once a month or per event or per podcast or per song or whatever. And there's something so fascinating about what happens creatively, which I didn't see coming at all.
You're one of the top 10 artists on Patreon in terms of amounts
Yeah,
committed to, I think.
So let me just give you a little bit of background because it'll help. After I wrapped up that massive Kickstarter, I needed to decide what my next step was in terms of how to monetize my art, how to pay the bills, how to sell the music. I haven't touched a major label or any kind of mainstream distribution in a really long time. And I thought, God, doing another Kickstarter is going to be exhausting. And then I looked into the far future and thought, oh my God, doing a Kickstarter again and again and rallying those 25,000 people annually is going to exhaust me and them. And most of those people are going to be repeat customers. There's got to be a better way of doing this. And right as I was thinking that, the CEO of Patreon called me up and said, I've got to tell you about what we're doing. I think you really are going to want to use this. And I considered it deeply for about a year and a half. I sort of looked at what the company was building. I was laying low anyway because I didn't have a record to put out or anything. And I finally decided to jump off the cliff and start a Patreon. And about 4,000 fans came with me for the initial maiden voyage. And that was 3 years ago. And now I've got 15,000 people giving me an average of about $3 or $4 a month to just create, to broadcast. It's a lot like donating or pledging to NPR, where they don't know what they're going to get. It might be a podcast, it might be a song, it might be an entire album, it might be a music video, it might be a filmed piece of performance art, it might be a talk, it might be an interview. It's content. These people are just paying me to make creative content that I see fit. And there's something so liberating about knowing when I go into the creative process that I will not have to monetize or find a way to monetize that art. I won't have to make the thing and then trot it out into the busy marketplace and bang my drum and try to sell it. It's pre-purchased. And there's not just something really comforting and liberating about that. There was a seismic shift at the very core of my soul when I started to understand that I was, again, this theme coming back up, right? That I was so trusted by these 15,000 people that they would dare to give me their $3 or $4 a month to just hear what I had to say, to just take on what I had to contribute. One of the other things that I wasn't expecting to have to face was actually this ego-crushing realization that just because 15,000 people were paying for me to broadcast 24/7 didn't mean they were going to tune in 24/7. I would send out song downloads and they would only be opened up by 4,000 of those 15,000 people. And I would sit there staring at the statistics saying, what? How can you be paying me to make art if you're not downloading it and listening to it? But of course, first of all, it's way better than the opposite problem of making a bunch of music and then not being able to share it or broadcast or sell it or get anyone's attention. But actually, once I realized that I was just basically a one-woman NPR and that people just were paying me to be always on so that whoever needed me at the moment could turn on their Amanda radio and tune in and get what they needed, I felt a huge amount of relief because I was like, right, not everyone has to pay attention to every word I say, listen to every song, read every blog, look at every little detail of the creative process. But these are people who just want my voice in the world.
So you've been able to make it like a more than a decent living just through Patreon. But I mean, you're Amanda Palmer. A question is, can this scale to art more generally? You look out at the world right now and there are like millions and millions of people graduating college and wondering, what the hell do I do with my life? The jobs that they maybe can get don't pay that well, and in any case don't seem that meaningful. And creative options they probably have. They want to do something that is meaningful, but they don't pay maybe at all. Can we picture a world where somehow we just persuade each other to double down on investing in creativity?
I think I know how to answer that question. One of the things that's sort of simultaneously disheartening but also very hopeful to me about what I've seen with Kickstarter and the journey of crowdfunding in general and now Patreon is I've always been kind of a unicorn in the music industry. My Kickstarter wasn't replicated again and again. I was the one who did it, and then I just expected that I was going to bust down the door and then all sorts of people were going to use Kickstarter. And, they have and they haven't. But one thing that really has shifted culturally is the shame associated with crowdfunding has just been slowly chipped away. When I first used crowdfunding in 2009 or 10, people in the music industry especially were very critical and very flippant about it. And, the best you would see around then was these people using crowdfunding or just begging their fans for money, dismiss, next. And then, of course, Kickstarter really and Pledge Music and Indiegogo, they proved themselves to be really useful, sometimes very powerful community platforms for galvanizing a group of people around an idea and paying for it. And some really important cultural moments, pieces of art, pieces of public art, pieces of music, pieces of theater were created using crowdfunding. And these were things that just wouldn't have existed if they had had to walk through the gauntlet of mass media, normal middlemen, the giant institutions that are supposed to be funding art. Like the people started to speak with their money about what creativity they wanted to see manifest in the world. And that was so inspiring to so many artists to say, wait a second, it doesn't have to be up to the 1% of the bureaucratic art people at the top to tell us what art is allowed to manifest in the world. The people are allowed to decide. And they're voting $1 at a time that this is the art they want to see. This is the voice they want to hear. These are the books they want to read. We're not just going to listen to the Met and the ballet and the people who have been authenticated to tell us what art we are supposed to enjoy. And there was a real revolution of like taking back the reins of creativity and what was allowed to manifest in the world. At the same time, people are still really afraid. And my Patreon hasn't really been replicated by many large artists, but I can see the seeds and like the beginnings of a kind of a tectonic shift taking place as more and more artists start sniffing around this idea, saying like, oh, maybe there's something in this. Being on a major label isn't working anymore. People aren't buying physical records. I'm going to have to feed my family. How am I going to do this? I can feel the shift the way I felt it with Kickstarter. I can measure it in phone calls that I'm getting from other large artists who are calling me up saying, does this really work and how do I do it? And it's a two-way street because the artists need to get on board with the idea that there can be this kind of exchange. And so does the public mind and the public opinion. And you can see this sort of like nervous dance of artists and creative people and the public sort of going like, wow, are we really allowed to just dance with each other? We don't need these other people. We don't need authentication from grant committees and the Met. And, I keep saying the Met. I love the Met. But you know what I'm saying? I'm using the Met to just represent some giant building somewhere that decides what art's allowed to be in the world. And I see it happening. And that gives me so much hope. Because the more I see that happening, the more I see a possibility beyond art, way beyond art. Like anything can manifest into the world when enough people get together and decide that this system just hasn't been serving them and that they're allowed to create a new system that's going to actually feed them and serve their souls and do the thing that it was meant to do.
What a conversation. Amanda, Teddy's ideas were spreading. I love finishing off by asking people, okay, you get to inject one idea into the heads of people listening. It's always a dangerous moment if you're listening right now and you don't want an idea from Amanda Palmer, switch off now.
Run away.
Run away. But if you could boil it down to one idea, what idea would you put out there?
I think I would say something that I say in my stage show after talking about the Boston bombing and that whole thing that happened with the poem and all of these journalists telling me that I had to understand that there was a limit to compassion and that there was a limit to empathy and that compassion and empathy are great, Amanda, but there are lines and you don't cross them. And I especially felt this after I went to a restorative justice retreat in a prison this last spring, and I watched men who were there and on double lifetime sentences who had committed premeditated double homicides in tearful conversation with the mothers who had lost their sons to gang violence. And, watching these two entities who were both suffering and in deep need of healing and closure. And being invited into this giant group therapy session of criminals and murderers and rape victims and parents who had lost their children to senseless violence, and how much this society needs that. And I really will double down on this idea and defend it until I die. I think not only are empathy and compassion possible in the darkest of circumstances, empathy and compassion are the most necessary in the darkest of circumstances. Because if we don't have it in the darkest circumstances, we can't fix anything. We can't change anything. And that is the sword I will die on.
Wow. I'm glad I asked you that question.
I'm glad you did too.
Gosh, there's so much I'd love to talk to you about. Your life is incredible. It is so funny thinking of your growing up track as rebel. Mine was the kind of the opposite of that. I wanted to be the person who did good somehow. And there's so much I feel like I can learn from you, Amanda. But
well, we both wanted to do good. It was just different packaging.
Different packaging.
Different packaging.
Amanda Palmer is a singer, songwriter, performer, and artist across many different formats. She's currently on tour with her latest art book and album, There Will Be No Intermission. To listen to Amanda's TED Talk, visit TED.com. This week's show was produced by Megan Tan. Our production manager is Roxanne Hylash. Our mix engineer, David Herman. Our theme music is by Alison Leighton-Brown. Special thanks to my colleague, Michelle Quint. Now, if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Or find some other way of sharing with anyone you know who is curious. Thank you for listening. On the next episode, New York Times columnist and author David Brooks. David and I dig into strategies for living a more meaningful life and why small communities have the power to change our political landscape.
Social change happens when a small group of people find a better way to live and the rest of us copy them.